Have you ever stopped to think that something you can't see, smell, hear, or touch could be extremely dangerous? Ionizing radiation is just like that. It surrounds us in hospitals, nuclear power plants, and even in some everyday materials. But how can something so invisible have such devastating effects on our bodies? What if I told you that doctors once used X-rays without any regulation, resulting in their patients losing their hair weeks later? It may sound like science fiction, but this was reality not too long ago. Radiation, an invisible and often lethal phenomenon, has gone from a dangerous fad to an essential tool in medicine and science. Right after the discovery of X-rays and radioactivity, using X-rays in radioactive materials became quite the trend. Suddenly, products like beauty creams, chocolates, cigarettes, water, and even suppositories with radiation-emitting elements appeared. Even doctors, when they needed to look inside your head, would perform X-rays. And after a few weeks, you'd notice your hair falling out. A little suspicious, to say the least. The main problem back then was the complete lack of exposure control. But let's go back to the beginning of the era of using radiation for medical purposes. People didn't really understand the maximum dose a human could absorb. Ionizing radiation becomes dangerous as it interacts with the matter that makes up living beings. Even with numerous negative cases showing the harmful effects of radiation, it became clear that while X-rays and radioactive nuclei were incredibly useful, they had to be used with caution. Today, they are widely used in disease diagnosis, cancer treatment, nuclear power plants, and even dating ancient materials. But the question is, why is ionizing radiation, something we can't taste, smell, or hear, so dangerous? Why does it kill, and what are its effects on the human body? I'll begin answering that by first explaining what radiation is. In simple terms, radiation is energy in transit, usually emitted by a source and transmitted through a vacuum, air, or material substances. We can see radiation in the form of particles, such as protons, neutrons, and electrons, or as electromagnetic waves, like visible light, X-rays, and gamma rays. But the crucial point is that when we talk about radiation as something dangerous, we're typically referring to a specific type of radiation. So what makes ionizing radiation different? Ionizing radiation is powerful enough to ionize atoms, meaning it can remove electrons from atoms. The energy required to ionize an atom depends greatly on how strongly the electron is bound to the atom's nucleus. Some atoms, like cesium, have electrons that are weakly bound, so it doesn't take much energy to remove the electron from the atom and ionize it. As you know, there's this magical thing called the periodic table, which shows us the different types of atoms that exist. Ionizing radiation interacts differently with most of them. But when we focus on the main atoms in the human body, such as hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, we can actually calculate the maximum energy value of radiation that can ionize these atoms in our bodies. So, when it comes to electromagnetic radiation, only X-rays and gamma rays have enough energy to knock an electron off an atom. And that's why you don't want to stand naked next to enriched uranium. Or worse, take a bite out of it. Don't do that. Only really strange people do that. Now that we know which type of radiation can cause harmful effects on the human body, where do we find it? The most well-known source is radioactive materials. One of the characteristics of radioactive nuclei is their instability. The universe hates instability, so when a nucleus becomes unstable, it emits particles in a desperate attempt to stabilize itself. This process can happen in three forms: alpha, beta, and gamma emissions. The names are in Greek letters, but we already know what they are, even if we don't know the Greek version. The alpha particle is identical to a helium nucleus without its electrons. The beta particle is just an electron, and gamma isn't a particle at all. It's electromagnetic radiation in the form of gamma rays. Typically, alpha particles, which are helium nuclei, can be stopped by a sheet of paper. Beta particles, which are electrons, are a bit more difficult and can be blocked by a layer of wood, for example. Gamma radiation is the toughest of the three, generally requiring a concrete wall to stop it. Even though these three forms of ionizing radiation, alpha, beta, and gamma, are fundamentally different, they all do the same thing: knock electrons out of atoms. And why is that so dangerous to the human body? The process of knocking an electron loose happens almost instantly, but it can lead to the breaking of chemical bonds, resulting in fragments of what were once well-structured molecules. These fragments can then attach to other molecules that they shouldn't be bonding with. This can happen to any molecule in our body, from water to our DNA. And that's when things get serious. Radiation has a chance of damaging our DNA, and the scariest part is that the biological effects of this damage to our genetic material might take days, weeks, months, or even years to manifest. There are two ways radiation can damage our DNA: direct and indirect. When radiation acts directly on our DNA, it breaks the chemical bonds between nucleotides, the molecules that make up our genetic material. Indirect radiation acts on water molecules, breaking them apart and producing reactive components. These components are unstable and quickly react with other atoms and molecules, capturing electrons to gain stability. The molecule that lost its electron then becomes a free radical, starting a chain reaction. DNA is composed of two strands in the shape of a double helix connected by hydrogen bonds. The damage caused by radiation to DNA can range from the loss of a base to the breaking of hydrogen bonds, the rupture of one strand, or even both strands. Fortunately, DNA has repair mechanisms to correct these damages, but they can become irreversible if too much damage occurs, or if a single strand break is not properly repaired. Approximately 33% of strand breaks are produced by the direct action on DNA, while the remaining 67% are caused by free radical attacks. This can result in two types of reactions: deterministic effects and stochastic effects. Deterministic effects are associated with cell death and are observed when a high dose of radiation causes the death of a large number of cells in a tissue or organ, impairing its function. In general, high doses of radiation only occur in accidents or in the case of radiotherapy, where the goal is to damage only the tumor. There's no need to be afraid of getting a chest X-ray in a quality-controlled environment, as there's no risk of a deterministic effect happening. The higher the radiation dose, the more severe the deterministic effect will be. However, below a certain dose, the number of damaged cells is too small for deterministic effects to be observed. Some tissue reactions can appear shortly after exposure and are usually linked to inflammation due to cell death by necrosis, where the cell swells and ruptures its membrane. This can cause skin burns, inflammation of the gastrointestinal mucosa, and skin peeling, as happened to some of the firefighters at Chernobyl. There are also late effects that appear months or years after exposure, and these are almost always due to the slow division rate of cells. An example is cataracts. Deterministic effects will always occur if a minimum dose threshold is reached and are always linked to cell death. Deterministic effects occur due to exposure of an individual tissue, but there are effects caused when the entire body, or a large part of it, is exposed to radiation. This is known as acute radiation syndrome, ARS. ARS refers to a group of symptoms that appear in stages over a period of hours to weeks after exposure. The unit of measurement we use for absorbed radiation is the gray, GY. To put this in perspective, let's use bananas. If the whole body absorbed dose is around 1 gray, which is equivalent to the radiation received from eating 10 million bananas or undergoing 50,000 chest X-rays, some people may experience nausea, diarrhea, and depression of the blood system. If the dose is between 1 and 3 GY, 30 million bananas or 150,000 chest X-rays, in addition to the previous symptoms, the person may experience severe infections. Between 3 and 5 GI, hemorrhaging, hair loss, and temporary or permanent sterility may occur. 50 million bananas or 250,000 chest X-rays. Around 10 grays, lung inflammation occurs, and at higher doses, the effects include damage to the nervous and cardiovascular systems, leading to death within a few days. 500,000 chest X-rays, or 200 times the maximum annual radiation dose legally allowed for people working with radiation. The generally lethal dose of ionizing radiation is around 5 gray. Some workers at Chernobyl received this dose in less than a minute. There are also stochastic effects, which are the long-term effects of ionizing radiation. These effects are linked to DNA mutations, with the most well-known stochastic effect being cancer. It's believed that the DNA repair mechanisms, especially those repairing double-strand breaks, are a major reason these effects occur. Stochastic effects are random and don't have a minimum threshold for occurrence. However, the higher the radiation dose, the higher the likelihood of them happening. Since they are random, only one alteration is needed to cause harm. Imagine that a DNA mutation is much more likely to cause cancer if there are 1 million DNA breaks rather than just one. Cancer-related effects are always delayed. The time between exposure and the detection of cancer can be several years. The human body is equipped to handle a single mutated cell. For a stochastic effect to occur, a large number of cells must be affected. It also takes a significant amount of time for mutated cells to divide enough to become problematic. For instance, leukemia typically takes about 8 years to develop after radiation exposure, while solid tumors may take decades to manifest. This depends heavily on how quickly the cells reproduce, which is why children are much more sensitive to radiation than adults. Since children are growing, they have many more cell divisions occurring compared to adults. Another stochastic effect is hereditary effects. These occur when a mutation happens in the germ cells and can be passed down to the offspring of the irradiated individual. It's important to note that these mutations only affect the descendants, meaning that if a mutation happens in you, it will only present changes in your offspring. But how do we know all of this? Where do we get this information? Deterministic effects were observed shortly after the discovery of X-rays and radioactivity because some of them were immediate. The delayed effects have been studied over time, especially when scientists and professionals who worked with radiation started developing these effects. Stochastic effects are different. Since they are probabilistic, they are harder to study. The main sources of data are large-scale radiation exposures, such as the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or populations living near Chernobyl. In these cases, knowing the date of exposure gives us a good idea of the radiation dose they received, allowing us to better understand the long-term effects. However, it's essential to consider that the link between someone exposed to radiation in Hiroshima and developing cancer is not straightforward. This is an observational study involving many people over the years, not a conclusion from a single case. Therefore, these studies are conducted over many years with a large number of individuals. Regarding hereditary effects, research on survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shows no evidence that radiation causes hereditary effects in humans. However, studies on plants and animals provide strong evidence that exposure leads to such effects. One hypothesis explaining the absence of these effects in humans is that multiple generations of plants and animals can be observed in a short period, unlike humans, where generational turnover is much slower. Yes, there are risks associated with the use of radiation, but our understanding today is far greater than it was in the early 1920s. The word radiation has been tainted throughout history due to several misuses, such as nuclear weapons that instilled fear in the population or terrible accidents like Chernobyl. The important thing to remember is that we have immense power in our hands, but we must use it wisely and carefully. In most cases, like in medicine, the benefits outweigh the risks. We can literally save lives using radiation, and that is the best possible use for knowledge that began in laboratories over 100 years ago.